Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks, and we are going to talk about the presidency, the life and times of one Richard Nixon, one of our most complicated presidents. So let's get at this, see if we can't study him and learn a little bit, a little reflection, study our past in order to improve our future, right? So let's get a little context. Once upon a time, we had President Harry Truman from 45 to 53. And the next guy was elected from 53 to 61. That would be Dwight David Eisenhower, who got smacked in the face with the 22nd Amendment. And the 22nd Amendment said, no more Mr. Eisenhower. He already served 8 years. So we're going to elect somebody from Brookline, Massachusetts. That would be John F. Kennedy, straight out of the Senate. And he's going to serve for 3 years before getting assassinated. His vice president, Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, is going to take over pretty much from 1963 all the way to 1969. The Vietnam War is going to destroy his reputation. Decides not to run, and then the Republicans are going to take the office back with Richard Milhouse Nixon. And there he is with his classic double V, double victory salutes. Often do that whenever he was happy. I think so, anyway. So, what is Nixon's story? Well, let's go back in time a little bit. In 1913, he was born, and the great state of California. There he is getting ready to play football. At that time, I don't think they wore helmets. He was a Quaker, I think the only Quaker president we've had, and that means kind of straight edge. No dancing, no swearing, no drinking, no drugs. Just to give you a little context, some time goes by and he grows up. And in 1941, World War II starts, and he joins the Navy, as do many presidential candidates do it. And one of our reflective questions is it important for a presidential candidate to have served in the military? In recent years, most of our presidents have not served in the military. Prior to recent years, almost all of them have. So if you're going to send troops into battle, should you yourself have been a troop at some time? I'm going to have to let you decide. Well, either way, he did join the Navy, and a bunch of time goes by. World War II ends. As of 1946, he joins Congress. He wants to make a difference. He wants to make laws to help people. So he joins the House of Representatives. That's the lower house of Congress. And his opponent is a guy named Jerry Voorhees. Now, this is going to be a long shot. Nixon is not going to be favored to win. The other guy was popular, but Nixon did something sketchy. We call it a red baiting. This is where he got his nickname Tricky Dick. Basically, the idea that he was a sketchy guy that would do anything to win, including immoral and unethical things, like accusing his opponents of being communists. So that's how he's going to get into the House of Representatives, a little red baiting. So my question would be, should saying exaggerated negative comments about your electoral opponent make you unworthy of getting elected? I mean, after all, we want somebody tenacious that's willing to do anything to get things done, but we don't want them to lie or be misleading, right? That seems a little unfair. And Nixon certainly was those two things. So how did he do in Congress? Well, he got famous. He was seen as a leader. He was on that famous HUAC committee, and he's going to be one of the ones that took down Edgar Hiss, one of the most famous spies with those pumpkin papers and whatnot. He's going to be a hero, and in 1950, he's going to leverage that heroism and move from the lower house to the more prestigious and powerful upper house. That would be the U.S. Senate. So he's going to get elected. The reason why it has more power is there's only 100 senators versus 435 representatives. Power is divided by less people, two per state. So winner, winner, chicken dinner. He also did a little red baiting to win that election. So again, Tricky Dick strikes again. So now as a senator from 50 to 52, he's going to be doing a good job. And Dwight David Eisenhower is running for president. Now, when you pick your running mate, your vice presidential candidate, you want somebody who's going to fill in the gaps of your weaknesses. Well, anyway, Eisenhower was old, and so he picks a very young running mate, and that would be Tricky Dick, Richard Nixon. And Nixon was famous for, taking down Edgar Hiss and so on. He was also from California, very powerful state in the Electoral College. Now, while they were running for president and vice president, the Democrats accused Nixon of being corrupt. They say he has a slush fund. People have donated money to his campaign, and he's used it for personal reasons. So Eisenhower's like, oh, this is controversial. I should kick Nixon off my ticket, kick him out. But then Nixon used his own money to go on to a national television broadcast, and he basically says, I didn't take money. Here he is. So that was him in the famous Checkers speech of 1952, basically making a joke out of the accusation. There he is with Checkers saying, oh, we did get this dog as an illegal gift, but we're keeping him because my kids love him. So people basically that endeared the people and made him look trustworthy, and the joke people laughed. So him and Eisenhower go on in 52 and win that election versus Adlai Stevenson. And then 4 years later, they win again versus Adlai Stevenson. Maybe the Democrats need a new candidate. I'm sure they'll get one. Well, in 1956 to 59, Nixon actually gets his greatest achievement, and that would be when he travels to Moscow to show off the American way of life. In this trip, the idea was that the Americans would show off what their culture was like, and hopefully the Soviets and us would see that we have more in common than apart. And so that's what we did. So Nixon travels there rather than Eisenhower, and he goes toe to toe with Khrushchev. Khrushchev comes up, and they start debating about which culture is better, which economic system is better. It's famously going to be called the kitchen debate because they're arguing about the merits of communism and capitalism. Nixon fought for capitalism while Khrushchev said that socialism is better. So the question is, capitalism leads to a large gap between the rich and poor. Does this make communism the better system? And it is true that capitalism does create a whole lot of poor people within a society. However, some people say it's not about creating equality, it's about creating the equality of opportunity, and that's capitalism's strength. The other thing is under socialism, in order to achieve equality and equity, what the government does is ensures everybody has what they need. And the problem is when your whole society knows they're going to have what they need, that there's no incentive to work as hard. And then when you have an entire society not working as hard, that can lead to a problem. So that's why Nixon would have thought capitalism was better. But anyway, they had their kitchen debate in 1959 to 1960. Now it is Nixon's time to run for president after Eisenhower has served his 8 years under the 22nd Amendment. That was it. Now Nixon's going against Kennedy. He loses that race, closest election in 100 years. And then he says, you know what, my way to run again, maybe in the next election, is I'm going to become a very popular governor. So in 62, he runs as the governor of California. He's supposed to win. After all, Nixon was the guy that went toe-to-toe with Khrushchev, right? He's the guy that just barely lost to Kennedy. He almost won the presidency. Of course he can win the governorship of one state. But he ends up losing that too. And the country's kind of shocked. How could he possibly lose? And the answer, short answer anyway, is that many people in California thought he was just using California as a stepping stone to get back to the presidency. And I think he kind of was. But here's Nixon's speech after losing, and it's definitely going to make him sound like a sore sport. So you won't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Now, Nixon felt that the reporters were the reason he lost the race, that they were unfair, that they were liberal and biased, and maybe they even were. But you won't have me to kick around anymore. It's your classic take your ball and go home. He was a sore sport, sore loser. And that's the optics of that is not going to look good. So my question here is when you do lose something, even if it's unfair, should you still act in a positive manner? And the answer is, I don't know. Some people say you should be authentic. If people treated you unfair, call them out. But you should know that you don't really look good doing that. And it's tough to come back from it. People lose a little bit of respect. They certainly did for Nixon in this case. He was deemed politically dead, never coming back. Although that's going to turn out to be wrong. For the next 6 years, he's going to travel the world, meet with foreign leaders, resurrect his reputation, fundraise for Republicans. In 1968, he gains an opportunity. That's unlikely. In 1968, the very popular Johnson becomes unpopular because of the Vietnam War and chooses not to run. Some people would say Bobby Kennedy would have then stepped it up and got elected, but he was shot and killed. Two assassinations in one family, very sad. And of course, the Vietnam War made the Democrats look terrible. So all you needed was a respectable Republican. They were probably going to win. So Nixon comes up, decides to run, and actually just barely beats the Democratic nominee, Hubert Humphrey, and ultimately gets elected president in 1968. So let's look at Nixon's presidency and, of course, society while he was president. So number one, the Vietnam War. Now, in 1968, at this point, the Vietnam War was very unpopular. 300 Americans were dying per week, never-ending protests. So does Nixon end the war? I mean, everywhere he looked in just about every city, it was people were erupting in anger. Nixon says, no, I will not end the war People are like, what are you talking about? Look at every newspaper, every broadcast. Americans don't want to be in the war. They're everywhere. And here's the lesson. It did look like everybody was against the war. Everybody was rioting and upset and protests and so on. However, Nixon says, I'm going to stay in the war, but that's not ignoring the people. It's very misleading. Everywhere you look, Americans seem against the war. But most Americans are not against the war. If you know where to look, like inside homes or inside communities, middle America very much supports the war and me. They want to stop communism from growing. They just happen to be content, so they're not making a ton of noise. They're boring, so they're not being covered in the news. So you have to look beyond what's in front of you, beyond the anger, to know what the majority of Americans want. So again, a discussion question. As a leader, should you prioritize helping those that act the most loud and angry and emotional about problems? Because you will be tempted to do that. You will be tempted to solve the problem in your face, the person yelling at you. But don't be confused. Nixon said that the majority of people often are not up in your face, and those are the people you should be serving. Don't get fooled by the angry voices around you as a leader. But still, Nixon had a phrase to describe this, and he referred to it as the silent majority. The majority, those that you are serving, are typically silent and hidden, and those are the people that you should be loyal to. And those people supported the war. That's why he didn't end the war. So again, his conclusion, though, was the war was unwinnable, and he didn't want to end it for that reason. So he started a program called Vietnamization, and Vietnamization was handing the war back to South Vietnam, pull American troops out, which he did very well in his first term, and give all the equipment and knowledge to the South Vietnamese so they would protect themselves. So, but here's the question about that. If the United States promises to protect another country, South Vietnam, is it acceptable for years later for the U.S. to stop protecting that country in order for the U.S. to save money and lives? And you have to say that. We basically did that. We pulled out of the Vietnam War, and they got conquered. South Vietnam was let down. They don't exist anymore. But was that okay for us to do, given that we were losing so many lives and our people were unhappy? Is it okay to break a promise to save your own skin, but to sacrifice somebody who you said you would protect? Something for us to think about. Well, anyway, in 1973, does Nixon finally get us out of the war? And he does. Nixon ends the war, and that's one of his greatest achievements, the Paris Peace Accords. He got the communists to promise to leave South Vietnam alone, and that allowed us to leave the war and no more death. And of course, once we did leave, they started the war again, and they conquered South Vietnam. It was almost like both of us got to claim that we won. So I think that's a huge accomplishment, although the loss is that South Vietnam was conquered. So anyway, he ended the Vietnam War. Now let's talk about China. From 1924 to 1949, the U.S. was very good friends with China. Not best friends, but good friends. But then in 49, the revolution that had been going on for a while won. The Chinese communists had taken over the country. And now we were enemies, no more friends. So we didn't talk, we didn't trade, we did lots of threats against each other. Both had nuclear weapons after 1962, and we were fearful of each other. During the Korean War, they joined the war and killed thousands of Americans. And during the Vietnam War, they gave trillions of dollars of weapons and supplies to North Vietnam, who then gave those weapons and money to the VC that killed 58,000 Americans. So we are angry at China. They are our enemy. So in 1972, Nixon had to figure out how to deal with the Chinese. And should we do more threats, more weapons to destroy them, more spies to undermine them, more troops in case we get into a war? Should we invade them and get rid of communism? But he didn't do any of that. He didn't do any of the things that all the hawks and cold warriors were saying we should. Instead, Nixon did an amazing thing. He actually traveled to China, the first U.S. president to go. And he went to China to open it up. The world was shocked. How could Nixon do it? Isn't this appeasement? Isn't this going to somebody evil who's killed Americans and is plotting against America and then trying to be nice to them? The problem with these moments is if you are desperately working on protecting the relationship of a country that you have, a relationship you have with an enemy country, if they do morally and unethical things, you're going to tolerate them to protect the relationship. And you're going to let them get away with things, just like Britain did that to Hitler in 1938. So a lot of people didn't like this idea. Well, anyway, Nixon, instead of being tough with China, is going to eat with them, drink with them, party with them, and ultimately be a tourist over there. But I would argue that this was, even though this was a little bit of appeasement and had those risks, the benefits was it lowered tensions, which meant less likely to have nuclear war. A greater chance at peace. Because we were now better friends with them, we could actually use that to leverage them to stop helping North Vietnam. And without help, they might agree to settle and end the war, which kind of happened. So it's going to increase trade, and then economically speaking, that's going to make both countries more wealthy. But most important, there was a little bit of triangular diplomacy here. There were three superpowers in the world, us, China, and the Soviet Union. And the one thing in 1972 that the Soviet Union feared was us being friends with China. So by us being friends with China, it made the Soviet Union fearful of an alliance between us and China. So the Soviet Union wanted to make things better with us, so that maybe them and us could team up against China. And so it's called triangular diplomacy, because the way to deal with an enemy is to become friends with their enemies and their friends, and they will realize that that power balance is against them, and then that will cause them to be nicer to you. So again, that is the best part of this. So, but anyway, a discussion here. When a country like China is perceived to be a hated enemy of the United States, in order to get them to do what we want, should we work tirelessly to fix that relationship and be friendly? Or should we get tough with them to intimidate them into doing what we want? It's kind of a hawk versus dove perspective. Nixon's going to prove that being a dove can work. So anyway, Nixon ended the Vietnam War, lost South Vietnam, but made peace with China, and that's going to take a long time, but started it. And also is going to make peace with the Soviet Union ever so slightly. So 1972, Nixon is going to become the first U.S. president to go to the Soviet Union right after going to China. And he's going to connect with Leonid Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union, through the 70s and part of the 60s. So anyway, Leonid Brezhnev is a tough guy, and here's Nixon not getting ready to destroy him, but instead laughing and making a better relationship, which of course is great. Now, the purpose to be there was to create a peace treaty of lowering weapons each. So Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, SALT I, and it's going to be talks that's going to lead to a treaty where we both agree to lower the amount of weapons we had, which is great, because that now that we have a relationship, that's smaller tensions. We have less weapons, so less likely to blow each other up. Number two, we're not getting into an arms race as much because we need less weapons, and that means we're going to save money for more important things. Number three, we're talking, which means we can manage our problems, which during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we weren't talking. That's why the problems got out of control. But the reason why SALT I would be negative is some would say it's appeasement. Instead of being tough with our enemy, the Soviet Union, we're now making nice with them and might even let them get away with things. Number two, if we slow down our weapon production, they can catch up, and that's exactly what they did. So we lowered the amount of weapons we had, and rather than spending our time getting as tough as possible, they caught up to us. And number three, can we trust them? Even if we make this agreement and we stop making weapons, how do we know they're going to stop? I don't think they violated this treaty, but you never know. At the time, there was definitely a real concern because we thought they were evil. Evil people or countries act in evil ways. So that said, Nixon's great. He's absolutely lowered tension between China and the Soviet Union. And that is going to be called a period of détente. Détente is a cooling of the Cold War, a thawing, so to speak. In the 50s and 60s, there was so much, we're going to blow up each other. We're going to all die. But in the 70s, we actually started to peacefully coexist with each other. That was called détente. And Nixon is absolutely deserving of credit. So anyway, SALT I is good. My question is, should the United States pursue arms reduction agreements with its enemies or build up weapons? Now, certainly Ronald Reagan in the 80s was like, let's build up weapons, intimidate, bankrupt our enemies. But who knows? Nixon went a different way. So in addition to ending the Vietnam War, opening up China and the Soviet Union, and signing SALT I, there is going to be another treaty that's an extension of SALT I, and that's going to be the ABM Treaty. In 1968, we had an endless amount of ICBMs, and there were so many of them. Now, to keep us safe, we did have MAD, mutually assured destruction, the idea that we can't use our nukes or we ourselves will die because we will all be killed. However, in 1968, though, there was a new type of missiles. Somebody had created a defensive missile. And the idea was these were called anti-ballistic missiles. They could surround cities and shoot down ICBMs. And that's going to make everybody worried, because if you can shoot down your enemy's missiles, that means you can destroy your enemy and still live. That destroys MAD and gives a country a first strike capability. And if you can destroy your enemy, you might just be foolish enough to try to do it and start World War III. So to fix this destruction of MAD, we signed an extension of SALT I called the ABM Treaty, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, where we agreed to not build any defensive missiles. There was one exception to this, but we're not going to talk about it now. No defensive missiles. And another benefit of this, we wouldn't get into another arms race. We could just spend endless amounts of money trying to perfect those missiles, but we're not going to build them. So we are completely defenseless on purpose. Kind of a weird thing, right? So that said, next discussion, should the United States support treaties that prevent both of us and our enemies from making defensive weapons? Doesn't it seem intuitive that we should want to be able to defend ourselves? Yet at the same time, that was going to put us more at risk, so we didn't do it. And that treaty lasted 30, 40 years. So anyway, in addition to SALT, we signed ABM. Nice job, Nixon and his negotiators. The oil embargo, dealing with it, was another success story of Richard Nixon. So here's the deal, that in biblical times, Jewish people had this land called Judea, or Israel, I should say, and they lost a bunch of wars and they got scattered across the earth. They became minorities in lots of countries, and they got abused, treated terribly, genocide in lots of places. And in the 1890s, a very popular concept came up called Zionism that said the only way the Jews of the world will receive fair treatment is if they have their own country so they can protect themselves. So they're not just a minority in a bunch of countries. And Zionism was we need to find a homeland for the Jews. Did not have a lot of support until a terrible event called the Holocaust happened during World War II that created empathy and sympathy for the Jews of the world and said we really do need to get them a country. So in 1948, it was basically decided that the biblical area of Palestine should be where this new Jewish country will be. So in 1948, the United Nations created a partition plan. They divided that area in half, gave half to the Jews of the world and half to the Muslim people that were living there. Now, the Jews of the world said yes, and they declared independence, and Israel was created, and hundreds of thousands of Jews migrated there immediately from around the world. And then the Muslims there said, no, we do not accept this plan. This is not okay. But as Israel was founded, they fled, felt that Israel was taking their land, which in some cases was true. And at that point, they fled for their lives, saying, you know what? There's going to be a war, and then we'll go back to our land after Israel loses the war. And there was a war in 1948-49. So 6 countries attack Israel, trying to push it back into the sea. And that said, Israel is going to win that war. So all of those people that lost their homes are going to be in refugee camps and have no place to live. And they're not going to be absorbed, for the most part, into those other countries. And that creates a group of people waiting for Israel to be destroyed. Now, that said, in 1956, there's going to be another conflict known as the Suez Crisis that led to fighting between Egypt and Israel. And Israel got the better of this fighting. But so ultimately, Egypt, the most powerful country of the area, is not going to be successful in wiping out Israel. In 1967, there's going to be another attempt to wipe Israel out, and that's when Syria, Jordan, and Egypt attack. Israel crushes all 3 in 6 days, the 6-day war. And this time, though, Israel takes even additional land. At this point, they conquer the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, also the Gaza Strip, the West Bank from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. Israel took this land so that they could push back their enemies to keep their people safe, right? So now the political organization of all the Muslim countries in that area is called the Arab League. They are unbelievably angry at this development and really believe that Israel has no right to exist, that land was stolen by Israel, and they're just waiting for their day to destroy Israel. 1973 comes up, and a 4th war occurs. Now, the start of this is somewhat complicated, but the idea was that Egypt and Syria were preparing to invade Israel. Israel actually did a preemptive strike on them because he saw that they were about to attack. A little bit complicated, but ultimately, at the beginning of this war, Israel does really, really, really poorly. They might actually get conquered for the first time. Jordan and Iraq hop in, and as Israel's about to lose, President Nixon says, we have to save Israel. And we, in an emergency way, get them 22,000 plus tons of tanks, artillery, and ammunition. And one can argue that with our money and resources, Israel is going to be saved. And the Arab League is unbelievably mad as Israel is saved and then starts to conquer Egypt and Syria. And the Arab League says, we need to basically do something about this. We blame the United States. And so most of the members of the Arab League, or many of them, are also in OPEC, Organization for the Petroleum Exporting Countries. Now, these countries don't have the biggest armies, don't have the most weapons, but they do have power. And that power comes in the form of most of the oil that the Soviet Union and the United States need for just about everything. So they decide to use oil as a weapon, and OPEC stops selling oil to the United States. And in the United States, oil triples by about 400%. That every factory and car runs on oil. This is going to destroy our economy. In fact, Richard Nixon says, please don't light up Christmas lights. We just don't have the power of electricity. Gas could not be sold on weekends. So you could only buy gas like once or twice a week, depending on the last digit of your license plate. If you tried to get gas, it was almost no hope. Massively long lines, and a lot of gas stations just ran out of gas. They didn't have any. So we even lowered the speed limit to 55 miles per hour. That lasted about 20 years. So our country's economy was going down the drain. We lost an endless amount of weapons. So here's what I would say. At that time, there was a consensus that Israel was the good country and our ally, and that they might get conquered. Now, should the United States support countries that we view as just, like Israel, even if it means our economy will be significantly hurt, in this case by the oil embargo? Should we do the right thing, even if it hurts our own economy? Well, we chose to. So how do you solve this problem? The Yom Kippur War is really making the Arab League upset and OPEC upset. And they basically said, we're not going to give you oil unless this war is done. You end it and click undo. So the Yom Kippur War is on, and the Arab League basically, again, is telling the U.S. too bad. So we need to end the oil embargo, which is destroying our economy. So how are we going to fix it? Well, Richard Nixon sends his right-hand man, Henry Kissinger, his secretary, or his national security advisor, later Secretary of State, to go negotiate. He did a great job in Vietnam, after all, sort of. So anyway, it's going to be known as shuttle diplomacy. The thing was that Syria wasn't willing to meet with Israel. Israel wasn't willing to meet with them. Israel wasn't willing to meet with Egypt, nor was Egypt willing to meet with them. So what Henry Kissinger did with no phones is he's going to get on a plane and fly back and forth, back and forth, back and forth as many times as possible, taking the terms and negotiating and so on. And ultimately, he works out a deal. Now, the deal is that Israel will get out of Egypt and will get out of Syria. And that's huge. Now, Israel says to do this, I need safety. I don't want them to keep attacking me every couple of years. So what happens is Henry Kissinger gets the United Nations to agree to put peacekeepers there. So that will protect Israel. And now they don't need to be invading that land. So basically, that also the final piece of this negotiation, Israel says that if we can't trade with China and India by accessing the Suez Canal, then we're financially dead. So that's the agreement. Egypt says, fine, I'll let Israel use the Suez Canal. So agreement number 4 gets peace. And Henry Kissinger ends the Yom Kippur War. The oil embargo is lifted. The U.S. economy gets to recover. Congratulations, Nixon and Henry Kissinger. So anyway, we do have another problem that Nixon was dealing with. In 1971, inflation was massively up. Why? Because there was excessive spending for about a decade in the U.S. The Vietnam War spent so much money, but also Johnson's Great Society, helping out the poor, a lot of spending. So how did that impact the people? Well, number one, people, it was like throwing money away. When you have massive inflation, all the prices are up, your money can't buy as much, you're losing. Number 2, inflation leads to a recession. A recession is when your economy gets smaller, less jobs, less businesses. Why is that true? Because when you have inflation, people are spending a lot more money on a lot less products, and that means you have a lot less savings. When you have less savings, customers have less money to buy things, and that means businesses are going to get less stuff bought, and that means they're going to go out of business or at least fire some workers. So a recession is basically a bunch of businesses going out of business and the workers losing as well. So that said, people don't have jobs, they will lose their homes, and life is very difficult during this period of inflation and recession. So what is Nixon going to do about it? Well, he takes all the prices and he declares them frozen. Nobody can raise prices, and all wages are frozen too. So he just says this for 90 days. He actually does it twice, so about half a year. And you would think that this is literally a good thing. We're freezing inflation. It stops it. But the problem is that when businesses raise prices, they're not just being greedy capitalists. They actually need to make a profit in order to stay in business, in order to feed their own families and to pay everybody and to keep buying expensive products to make their own product. And if you tell them they can't raise their prices, they're going to lose money. And instead of losing money, they'll just shut down their businesses. And that's exactly what's going to happen when you price freeze. There's also going to be a shortage of goods because people aren't going to be willing to make them for no profit. And if you freeze prices, they can't raise them to be profitable. So that said, the discussion here is when faced with a high inflation, should the U.S. freeze prices and wages as a way to stop inflation? And the answer is no. That messes with the free market, and that's only going to work temporarily anyway. Eventually, you're going to unfreeze things, and then they're just going to jump up. So that said, space missions, another example of Nixon doing well. In 1962, President Kennedy said, we will get on the moon before the end of the decade. And it's going to be a little race between us and the Soviet Union that we are going to win. In 1969, Apollo 11, we are indeed going to walk on the moon. That's Neil Armstrong, and Buzz Aldrin also got there. And Nixon's going to put a plaque down on the moon, still there, that says, we have come in peace for all mankind, right? And there's Richard Nixon's signature there. It's kind of ironic because his enemy, Kennedy, was the one that promised this, but Nixon's the one permanently on the moon, right? So from 1969 to 72, there's going to be 6 total manned moon landings. Pretty impressive. But the United States in 1972 is going to stop. It's going to be like, it's too expensive, dangerous. We've had a bunch of missions where people have died. So we've already won the space race. We've shown the Soviet Union we're number 1. Maybe we should stop. Is that a good decision? And the question is, should the United States continue to spend billions of dollars per month to travel further into space? And truthfully, in the year 2023-24, just now, the United States is trying to get back to the moon. And also the rest of the world, including China. We took about, 30, 40 years off, and now we're heading back, which is kind of an interesting decision. Is it worth all that money? Is there really anything to be gained besides pride and prestige? Hubris. So either way, Nixon is going to do quite well for the space race and so on. Get to the moon a bunches of times. And that leads us to the election of 1972. Nixon has had an amazing 4 years. The only thing, he hasn't ended the Vietnam War, but okay. He's going to go up against Democratic challenger George McGovern. Last time it was Hubert Humphrey. So right before the election, about a week, Henry Kissinger says, "Oh, I've been negotiating with the Vietnamese. We believe peace is at hand. In other words, I've negotiated an end." And everybody's like, "Oh yeah, we're so happy the Vietnam War is over." And Nixon wins landslide, 520-18. That's crazy number of electoral votes, right? That he accumulated. The only state that didn't vote for Nixon, as you can see, is Massachusetts, of course, Washington D.C., and a couple other random votes. Now that said, at this time, Watergate is looming, and Watergate is going to display that Nixon did some criminal activity, and he is going to surrender. Thank you, President Nixon. And ultimately, that is the end of our presidency. Thank you for staying with me through that entire analysis of his presidency. Hopefully, we reflected, and hopefully, our reflections can help us think in terms of creating a better future from our mistakes and successes of the past. Thank you so much, and have a fabulous rest of your day.